Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and the season finale of our World Affairs Roundup. Before retiring to their palatial summer estates, our Roundup regulars are here to revisit some stories that have had considerable legs this season and offer a few thoughts on how they might evolve over the summer, including ninth inning rally. Reports of the imminent demise of the Assad regime in Syria have proved premature. With peace talks proposed in various foreign capitals and fighting continuing on the ground, how might the conflict unfold in the weeks ahead? At least the shawarma was good. Secretary of State John Kerry was in the Middle East last week trying to apply the defibrillator to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Will the summer see any movement on this front, or is it flatline for the foreseeable future? Raising canes and an I told you so moment for Keynesians, the IMF's chief economist last week warned that Britain's Austerians, led by Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, were playing with fire. Will the European summer of discontent usher in major changes in economic policy? We'll also have an over-the-horizon segment in which our panel will identify underreported stories likely to surface this summer while we're enjoying backyard weenie roasts and afternoons at the ballpark. Well, welcome back, everyone. John, I'd like to start with Syria and some reports that have come out from various intelligence agencies saying that perhaps the Assad regime is not teetering on the brink to the extent that we thought it was.
Not only that, they are getting major arms shipments from Russia as well to be able to defend aerial assaults and other kinds of threats. This leads up into what both the United States and Russia are calling Geneva II, a conference, as far as I know, that doesn't have a specific date yet, but that Assad is allegedly willing to attend, and the opposition is attempting to get itself organized to be able to attend as well. Whether or not anything is going to come out of this is a question mark. On the battlefield, one of the major points, though, that we may want to talk about is the role that Hezbollah has been playing in bolstering Syria's ability to be able to perform on the battlefield, and how this is also spilling over into Lebanon.
Well, and Secretary Kerry in his visit has said there's evidence that Iranian fighters are on the field as well. So what about that? I mean, how does the sort of widening of this conflict play into what the U.S. might be doing?
Well, I think that we're now seeing increasingly a regional conflict, and as a result, I mean, since the last show, the Israelis also were accused of sending missiles into Syria. There are definitely Iranians there, Hezbollah, all the foreign jihadists who we've talked about before. And at the same time, there's also discussion of Syria actually breaking up. So Assad may be winning in the sense that he's gained some ground, but I think that the recognition that this conflict needs to be resolved in some way and that it can't be resolved militarily is turning it more and more into an international issue that I think that the major parties are going to appreciate the gravity of the situation.
Well, and Robert, we talked a little bit about this proposed conference. One of the preconditions the opposition have said is that Assad can have no part in any transition government. If he's in fact ascendant on the battlefield these days, what incentive does he have to come to the table?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, the assumption was that he was teetering on the brink and he might want to cut a deal to get out of the country safely. And if that's not the case, and it appears not to be a case right now, then you're right, there's no incentive. And you have the opposition losing credibility in some ways because of foreign fighters, because they're mostly exiles who aren't in the country anyway. And so this strengthens Assad's hands as well, especially if he's getting major international support. And so this is a major problem. It bears remembering that this was a peaceful protest movement that became a civil war because of the behavior of the Assad regime. But now there's no clear pathway to get rid of the Assad regime, and most objective observers think you can't really have a settlement as long as he's still there anyway. And so it's a real dilemma, and you don't have the United States wanting to get into another war. I mean, they got beat up enough around Libya, which was a much more limited engagement than this would be. And so there's no clear pathway out, which is a tragedy for the people in Syria, and it's becoming a regional war, which makes it much more dangerous as well. So I think there's probably going to be more bad news over the summer rather than any good news, very unfortunately.
We're going to have to watch Turkey's role in this whole process, because they have been probably the most outspoken in terms of against the Assad regime. But we also have to remember that you have to put this into the context of the Sunni-Shia struggle throughout the region, with Saudi Arabia backing the Sunnis, which are the majority in Syria, and Iran backing the Shia, or in this case the Alawites, which is the regime's, Assad's grouping. So that continues, and it will probably continue throughout the summer.
And what is the Israeli dimension in this?
Well, the Israelis, their biggest concern is Hezbollah over the border in Lebanon, as well as the whole issue of the Golan Heights. Apparently there have been skirmishes in the Golan Heights too. So the Israelis will do whatever they need to do to try and protect their territory and opt to any side that they think will provide for the most stability, but it doesn't look great for them.
Well, yeah, all sides are against Israel in this thing, so they can't pick a winner.
Well, one aspect of the story that seems to have sort of gone away is, whereas previously we heard the use of chemical weapons was an absolute red line for the U.S., there's evidence to suggest there was some at least limited use of chemical weapons, but it's a red line that I think policymakers in Washington prefer not have been crossed, and so the findings seem to be that we still don't know yet.
It's a silly proposition. I mean, the line between conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction, so quote unquote, is not a bright line. In fact, a lot of conventional weapons are much more destructive than chemical weapons. We have the same thing with small-scale nuclear weapons versus major conventional weapons. And so it was a silly line in the sand to paint. But it's embarrassed the administration now that there seems to be some evidence of chemical weapons. But it's a silly line in the first place to have drawn.
But it also comes back to what Robert said earlier about we don't either have the will or the money to be able to get seriously involved.
Or the politics, which is part of the will. Right? Yep.
So, sort of getting out of the story, where will we find ourselves when we come back in the fall on this tale?
Talking about it again.
Instead of 80,000 deaths, there will probably be 90,000.
I don't know what's worse. We might be talking about Assad winning, which would be disastrous, or we'd be talking about a continued stalemate, which is disastrous for the people of Syria and for the region. I hope the Israeli leadership understands that instability is not in their interest. I know that we agree it's not, but I'm not sure they know that. They may think the instability somehow strengthens their hand, which I think would be a major miscalculation.
Well, speaking of Israel, Secretary Kerry paid his fourth visit in as many months to Israel to try to jumpstart the peace process there. Let's talk a little bit about the environment right now on both sides and among the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. Are these talks likely to, first of all, happen in the first place? And if they do, likely to go anywhere?
It's a mess because the politics on both sides are very, very difficult. There are the politics on the Israeli side where the justice minister who's leading the talks is caught between very strong personalities on the right and the left. With the Palestinians, you still have the split between Hamas and Abbas.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and So it's a very, very difficult issue. I think that if anything's going to happen, I think with all diplomacy, it has to happen in secret. And that's pretty obvious, but hopefully something like that is happening right now, but I shouldn't be too optimistic.
Well, Robert, it seems one of the real sea changes in the environment is you now have an Israeli government that's divided on the proposition of the two-state solution as the ultimate way forward.
Right.
The Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee chair, Avigdor Lieberman, said at this point the conflict can't be solved, it can only be managed. So, where do we go from there?
You have an Israeli leadership that doesn't want to negotiate a peace, right, independent of the problem with who you negotiate with, the Palestinians, who you negotiate with. And this makes it very unlikely there can be progress. To some extent, John Kerry, in some of the media in Israel, was swift-boated at his visit and called ineffectual, etc. So that I know the Obama administration feels like they have to, being in their second term, go through the motions to show they tried to get peace. I'm not sure they believe that there's any real prospect for peace, right? And I think there's a problem, even though about a third of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, thinks that there should be peace talks. That's only a third, right? Though that's a substantial part of Israeli opinion, that the current dominant party actually thinks it's in their interest to hold on and not have peace, and that's not the long-term interest of Israel. So my biggest concern is that they see immediate security as the interest of Israel when it's not, and it leads to a much more dangerous situation in the short and the long term.
So what's the incentive on the part of the Obama administration to put so much capital into the process at this point?
Well, actually, I'm surprised. I thought we were making a shift to the east. This was the swan song of Hillary Clinton. This is what Obama had been talking about, and all of a sudden we're back trying to resolve a Middle East process that there hasn't been any progress in terms of communication, which would allow you to move on to the next phase.
So are we in a situation where, once again, the goal is the fact of talks rather than the substance that might come of them?
I can't see any other reason.
Well, Kerry is the first Secretary of State in a long time who personally is putting his reputation on the line for this. And I think there's something irresistible about it, because if you can solve this, then you've really made, your way into the history book.
Sort of thing?
Yes, yes. So, but he really is putting everything into that, and in a way, it's not surprising.
So, we've got just about a minute before our break, but the status quo really, at some level, might be perceived as working for the Israeli government. What about the Palestinians? What's their alternative to talks? I mean, there's some talk about there are 16 international organizations they may try to join to sort of bolster their image of sovereignty. What happens with that?
Well, they're living in appalling poverty with an economic opportunity. They don't have a state, right? They're divided themselves. So it's a tragedy and a nightmare for the Palestinian people as long as this goes on. And there doesn't seem to be an exit strategy of any kind, even making progress, as John has pointed out and Ann has pointed out.
I think that their threat, or the fact that they're talking about applying to the International Criminal Court, is something that seems to bother the Israelis. So in that, they have a little tiny bargaining chip there.
So, same exit question on this topic. At the end of summer, will we have seen talks? Any movement on this?
Of which year?
Well, I think that's our answer.
And the settlements will continue as well. That it will continue to aggravate the situation.
All right. Well, we'll move on to other regions and other climes when we come back. First, we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. Let's go now to Europe, where this past week some eyebrows among practitioners of the dismal science of economics were raised when the chief economist of the IMF suggested that austerity, in fact, may not be the way to go. Robert, tell us about that.
It's been a disaster in Europe and in Great Britain. We have the bizarre specter of the IMF, which has a history of getting third world countries to take their medicine and go through harsh austerity, saying we should not have austerity, that this is damaging the economy. In the U.S., we would have austerity based on the gridlock in Washington, except for the fact that we can essentially create new money through the Federal Reserve System. They don't have that option in the Eurozone, and so it's even worse in Europe. But there seems to be this consensus across the West, right, that somehow the way you deal with a financial situation and debt and deficit is austerity, even though that essentially slows down the economy and makes the situation much worse and causes instability, is what we're seeing in Southern Europe. So it's amazing, but there's still strong resistance from a lot of leaders to realizing that austerity has failed, and it was doomed to fail.
Well, the statement by the IMF economists is really directed at the UK, but at a Brussels summit, the Euro Commission chair, Jose Manuel Barroso, said basically that austerity has reached its limit. So if you take it out to a Europe-wide level, it seems to be they're reaching the same conclusion.
That's right. They've come. What has surprised them is the extent to which austerity has led to massive unemployment, and those figures are really, really very, very troubling. 59% of the youth in Greece under 25 are unemployed. It's in the 50s too for Spain and Portugal. So that's where they're having to sort of shift gears, because those levels of unemployment are untenable. And the IMF did a study recently showing that, looking at the relationship between austerity and unemployment. And so cuts in the budget or if austerity measures lead to much higher unemployment than they had expected. So I think this is what's fueling a lot of this.
So, John, are you a closet Keynesian or?
Well, actually, Keynes was a wonderful model for the industrial age, but I'm not sure we're there anymore. But one of the factors that governments forget about Keynes is that during good times, government is supposed to cut back on spending, and it's in bad times. Well, I haven't seen any of these governments, including our own, that have followed through what was supposed to happen during better times. Government hasn't cut back. Following up on her point, on the increasing austerity impact on unemployment, well, when you have a case like France, where you have about 20% of the workers are working for government, when you go into austerity, yes, you are going to have a serious impact on unemployment. I was going to make one other comment. I think that most of the political leaders over on the other side of the pond in old Europe, as opposed to over here in the United States, are still thinking this is a recession, a cyclical recession. And what many economists are saying, this is a structural recession, and it is much more difficult to get through. And I don't hear anything coming out of any of these people that are suggesting that they have a grip on this.
So what is the likely political impact of all of this over the next several weeks and months? I mean, are we going to see sort of a political aftershocks of what will be a U-turn in economic policy?
I don't think it's really a U-turn, though, because they're saying, okay, we'll give you a little bit more time to lower your deficits, but they're also saying you still have to cut jobs. And so there's still going to be more unemployment, and it's not as if they're sort of saying, okay, start spending and creating jobs. So we're going to have more of the same, I think.
They're easing austerity. They're not actually priming the pump, and so the crisis continues, right? They're not making it worse is the problem. They don't have a Federal Reserve. It's like the Federal Reserve Board of the U.S., believe it or not, is the only entity that seems to fully get this and be able to go around the political structures with quantitative easing.
How much of a political impact is this likely to have?
Well, watch the German elections that come up in the fall as a barometer, and how much pushback there is against Merkel if she tries to be accommodating to the Southern Europeans.
I think that's right. There's a problem that where the Germans, hold the cards, and the German population tends to see Southern Europe as somehow being unworthy because they've run inefficient or unaccountable economies, and therefore they should suffer, which is, a real problem. You can't have 59% unemployment for young people in Greece and have a stable situation.
Right.
Well, now let's take a moment to look over the horizon at some of these less well-reported stories. John, I think you'd like to take us to Asia.
Well, I see the water there, and we're going to look over at the South China Sea. It's a small collection of islands, not of any particular economic importance, but there's energy resources there, and there's fishing rights. And what we run into is something called the exclusive economic zones, which goes out 200 to 250 miles off the shore, and what we have is overlapping jurisdictions and lots of competition. We also have China, which is becoming slightly more aggressive and certainly with a larger navy. And so all of a sudden, a number of the countries of Southeast Asia and Vietnam are finding the United States might be a wonderful and welcomed broker or offset for what China is trying to do in that part.
So this is the Asia pivot.
That's right. That's where I thought we were heading.
So what's likely to be the result then of this competition? Well, I mean, how hot could it get?
There could be shooting. There has been shooting. There has been shooting, but on a very minor scale. And we could get in the way as we begin to, especially with Taiwan involved. We will have to watch this one carefully.
And you want to jump to a different continent and talk about some issues in Africa.
That's right. I think that as the media focuses on events in Benghazi from September 2012, we're losing sight of what's happening in Libya right now, for one country. There's a lot of instability, a lot of conflict between militias and the government in power, a number of consulate bombings. Our embassy has been stripped down to only essential personnel. So is the UK's. The French has been bombed, and it's just sitting there in ruins. So there's a lot of instability there, and our media isn't focusing on it. Another place where there's instability, well, there are a lot, but Mali and the Democratic Republic of the Congo both are getting infusions of UN peacekeepers to try and solve those problems there. And particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there have been at least 5 million deaths in their civil war. For the first time, the UN is sending 3,000 troops, and they are supposed to have limited offensive capabilities, which means that they will actually be able to use guns. Yes. So there are a lot of interesting stories there that bear watching.
So is there a thread that sort of ties them together?
Well, instability, and also the role of the Islamist groups and other terrorist groups. There are threads all throughout Africa, and there are links between the Libya conflict, the Mali conflict, and then Mali moving over into Niger, and all the way where there was also been instability all the way over to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So you can trace threads all the way through.
And is there a U.S. role in all of this?
The U.S. has been, except for its role in the Security Council, which authorizes these peacekeeping operations, the U.S. has been taking more of a back seat. China, of course, is very active. China just announced that it was sending 500 peacekeepers in the Mali group, so they're taking a very active role there.
Looking after their resources.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. Mm-hmm. Gold in Mali.
Robert, where do you want to take us?
Well, I think there may be news this summer, about whether we're going to turn away from a fossil-based economy, which is a global cataclysm with global warming. If we don't start acting on it, there's the question of whether we're going to pipe the tar sands oil through the U.S. from Canada. But there's also a lot going on also out in the Pacific Ocean, where Japan and the United States are working hard to unlock hydrocarbons that we didn't have that technology even to use before, which are vastly more plentiful than all the oil in the world. And if that would happen, not only is it potentially make the climate situation much, much worse because it's fossil fuels, but it actually could destabilize the whole area of the world that's based on oil revenue in the Middle East, Russia, etc. So it could also be a huge geopolitical change. But ultimately, the more we get technology to unlock these fossil fuels, the more likely it is that we do not head off global warming, and then, I mean, that's going to be the biggest cataclysm of all, is going to flood a huge percentage of the cities of the world by the middle of the next century. So I think if it's we have those issues around, say, the pipeline, but also I would say if it's a hot summer, we'll have global warming being discussed more. It tends to be based on how hot a particular summer is. If there's not, we may have defenders of fossil fuel claiming, see, it's a perfectly nice summer, therefore there's no problem.
What summer?
Right, see, so there you go.
So what are these new sources of fossil fuels? I mean, are these oil deposits?
They're not oil. They're kind of methane. They're kind of methane hydrocarbons. They used to be considered something that would be just a waste process in traditional oil refining. But there's vast quantities of them at the bottom of the ocean, and we're actually getting. The Japanese have been trying to look at this for 10 years. We're getting close to being able to actually exploit these potentially within a couple of years. If that happens, we change the whole global economy because we have to worry about where there's oil in the Middle East or in Russia, for example, or even natural gas for that matter. So it's going to. It's a global, it's a climate problem and an environmental problem, but it also changes the whole global economy if you could actually unlock that resource.
And whose real estate is it at this point?
Well, it's John's point comes in. It's a lot of people's real estate. Yes. But the Japanese and the U.S. have invested the most in trying to unlock this. The Japanese by far the most because they don't have oil, and they've always considered their dependence upon foreign oil to be a big national problem.
Interestingly, the Southeast Asian countries would like to have a united approach to dealing with China over this area. China wants to do it bilaterally. I wonder where they learned that from.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. And to our panel, thank you very much. And to our viewers, we'll leave you with a postcard from our group, as always. See you in the fall with more World Affairs Roundup.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,